Hi, we're McKenna and Chloe, and we're here to explain how the creation of sign language has broken barriers in history and in the world of communication. Over the centuries of time, people have only had one means of language and connection, that is, talking, speaking, and conversing. These things were verbal and required a hearing and a verbal response back. However, hearing impaired people and communities were excluded from this. They had no way to communicate other than writing on paper, which was too time-consuming and inconsequential in comparison to speak. Sign language, not only for English speakers, was monumental to breaking the barrier that the hearing impaired couldn't be included in a conversation, and to give a voice to those hushed into silence. ASL became a fully developed communication system only in the early 19th century, following contact between the American reformer Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and deaf Frenchman Laurent Clerc. In 1817, Gallaudet, Clerc, and a group of philanthropists opened a school for deaf children in Hartford, today's American School for the Deaf. The American School became the incubator for ASL. Clerc stated that he modified the sign language he brought from his homeland to fit American customs. There were many attempts to stop sign language. For example, reacting to an emerging deaf subculture, an oralist movement began in the 1880s to oppose sign language and insist that deaf people learn speech and speech reading. Led by Alexander Graham Bell, it took over much of deaf education and sought to disperse the deaf community. Beginning in the 1870s, Alexander Graham Bell led a loose coalition of progressive educational reformers, nationalists, and eugenicists who attacked ASL and advocated the use of speech and speech reading in its place. They claimed that signing was primitive, associated with backwards people, that its ease of use prevented deaf people from learning to speak, that it nurtured among deaf people a culture apart from the mainstream and thus threatened American cultural homogeneity, and that it encouraged deaf people to marry among themselves, possibly threatening the nation with the birth of more deaf children. Most hearing educators, hearing parents of deaf children, and school governing boards accepted these claims for decades. By the 1890s, schools were firing deaf teachers and banishing ASL from classrooms. Serious study of ASL, which had marked its early years, ceased. However, this harmed the deaf community and ceased the teaching of ASL. It was not taught in schools anymore, but deaf Americans kept it alive in the shadows. Preservation of Sign Language by George W. Veditz was a 14-minute-long film where he demonstrated in sign language the importance of defending the right of deaf people to sign. Deaf Americans nevertheless kept ASL vibrant as the 20th century began, passing it from pupil to pupil in school dormitories and playgrounds, and from adult to adult in deaf clubs. Deaf leaders produced ASL dictionaries, and they filmed ASL masters to preserve classic forms for future generations. Various local deaf communities argued for ASL's reacceptance into school. The educational failure of speech and speech reading, moreover, became increasingly obvious in the late 20th century. ASL became a fully developed communication system only in the early 19th century, following contact between the American reformer Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet and deaf Frenchman Laurent Clerc. In 1817, Gallaudet, Clerc, and a group of philanthropists opened a school for deaf children in Hartford, today's American School for the Deaf. The American School became the incubator for ASL. Clerc stated that he modified the sign language he brought from his homeland to fit American customs. As ASL began to grow again and was starting to be accepted, other sign languages had broken their own barriers and were immersing the deaf culture into society, such as French schools popularizing LSF and deaf Americans and sign language teachers benefiting from the language. Even in mainstream media now, sign language has allowed the deaf community to be represented and for deaf actors to be able to do what they love, despite the barriers. Some examples of this are this change are Switched at Birth and The Society, which both have hearing-impaired actors and actresses, and their cast all learn sign language in order to communicate behind the scenes, which demonstrates how far the barrier has been broken in spreading sign language further. Also, the internet, specifically YouTube, has truly spread sign language. On the platform now, there are thousands of videos teaching people sign language and videos to educate people on how deaf people are just like everyone else, such as on Cut. TED Talks are uploaded and helpful in spreading awareness as well. Hearing-impaired communities were excluded from the most basic form of human contact communication. They had no way to communicate other than writing on paper or reading lips, which was too time-consuming and inconsequential in comparison to speak. Sign language was monumental to breaking the barrier that the hearing-impaired couldn't be included in a conversation. Sign language has broken the barrier between those who can hear and those who cannot. It has allowed for communication to flourish through and for ideas to be communicated and relationships to develop where they may have never been without sign language. This can be seen through sign language transcending television, YouTube, and public speaking for events such as TED Talks. After this research, Chloe and I have come to see the beauty in sign language and the history behind a language and the culture of an entire community. It has inspired us to start learning sign language, and we hope many can come to the same conclusion and move forward to preserving such an important language.